Upon seeing me and my two homeless children in the middle of the storm, the millionaire decided to take me to his mansion. What he did to me and my children left me speechless. The night was fierce. The sky, painted with a menacing grey, was split by lightning that briefly illuminated the deserted road. The rain fell mercilessly, drenching everything in its path, as if nature itself were mirroring the anguish consuming Isabel. Every drop felt like an added weight to the young mother, who trudged forward with difficulty, holding little Sophia in one arm while Pedro tried to keep up beside her, fighting against the icy wind. The wind howled, and Pedro's words were almost lost in the chaos. "Mom, it's so cold," he murmured, his voice trembling. Isabel stopped, pulling Pedro close and adjusting the thin blanket covering Sophia. The girl was feverish, her face pale and her eyes half closed. Isabel could feel Sophia's rapid, weak breathing, and panic swelled in her chest. She knew that without shelter, Sophia's condition could worsen quickly. They walked a few more steps before something appeared in the distance. Under the flickering light of the lightning, a colossal structure came into view, a mansion surrounded by ancient trees, its tall gates seeming to guard the place from any intruders. Isabel hesitated. The house exuded wealth and luxury, and she couldn't imagine anyone inside willing to help a woman in rags carrying two children. But Sophia's face, burning with fever in her arms, gave her the courage to move forward. Pushing the gate, which, to her relief, was unlocked, she climbed the steps to the entrance. Her heart raced as her soaked clothes clung to her skin. She knocked hard on the heavy door. The sound echoed like a smaller thunderclap, but nothing happened. For a moment, Isabel thought about giving up, but necessity won out. She knocked again, this time more desperately. After several long seconds, footsteps were heard. The door opened just enough to reveal a man's face, serious, almost cold. Lucas stared at Isabel without saying a word, his eyes scanning the scene before him, the drenched woman holding a visibly sick child and another shivering beside her. He hesitated, as if unsure what to do, and Isabel's voice broke the silence. "Please, help me. My children are cold, and my daughter is sick. We just need somewhere dry, just for a moment." Lucas narrowed his eyes, weighing her words. He wasn't known for opening his home to strangers. His world was built on rules, routine, and solitude, a safe, controlled universe. But there was something in Isabel's voice, a mix of fear and determination, that made him open the door a little wider. "Come in," he finally said. His voice was firm, almost curt, but Isabel didn't care. The room they entered was a stark contrast to the world outside, warm, brightly lit, and decorated with a cold elegance. Isabel felt an immediate sense of relief as the heat enveloped her, but she quickly noticed that the man who had let them in was as cold as the storm outside. "Sit," he said, gesturing to the sofa. He watched as Isabel carefully laid Sophia down and pulled Pedro close, trying to warm him with her hands. "What's your story?" he asked, his voice direct, with no trace of sympathy. Isabel took a deep breath, trying to summon the strength to respond. I'm running away. My situation is complicated, but I'm not here to ask for anything more than a roof to protect my children tonight. Please." Her voice broke, and she looked away. Lucas watched her with an impassive expression, but something about her unsettled him. He could see the exhaustion on her face, the trembling in her hands, the protective way she held her children. It stirred buried memories, ones he preferred to forget. Without another word, he left the room and returned minutes later with towels and some dry clothes, likely belonging to a household staff member. He handed them to Isabel. "Change their clothes. The kitchen's over there. There's soup on the stove," he said without meeting her eyes. Isabel hesitated, surprised by the gesture, but she murmured her thanks. As she tended to the children, Lucas watched from a distance. He saw how Isabel held Sophia in her lap, singing softly to calm her, even though she herself was exhausted. Pedro, now warmer, managed a shy smile as he sipped the soup. It was a simple scene, but something about it touched him in an unexpected way. That night, as the children slept in an improvised bedroom and Isabel curled up on the sofa in the living room, Lucas stood by the window, watching the rain lash against the glass. His mind was a whirlwind. He didn't know exactly why he had helped the woman, but he knew something had changed. The cold emptiness of his house had been filled, if only briefly, with a life he didn't recognize but found strangely necessary. The storm outside was beginning to calm, but inside the mansion, tension lingered in the air. Lucas, standing by the fireplace, observed Isabel. Even in dry clothes, she looked fragile, her hunched posture and watchful gaze revealing the constant vigilance life had forced upon her. Sophia, cradled in her mother's arms, was breathing with difficulty, her face still warm with fever. Pedro, standing nearby, took in everything with curious eyes, though his exhaustion was evident. Lucas finally broke the silence, his voice firm. "I've given you a warm place and food. Now, I want to know what brought you here." Isabel hesitated. Her instincts told her not to trust him, but she knew she had no choice. Sophia needed help, and running again wasn't an option. Taking a deep breath, she began to speak. "I had nowhere else to go. I ran away from my husband." Lucas raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "And why did you run away?" She looked at him, her expression hardened by painful memories. "Because he hurt me. He hurt." Her voice faltered, and she clutched Sophia closer to her chest. "My children. I couldn't stay there anymore. When I tried to get help, even my own family turned their backs on me." Lucas crossed his arms, studying the woman in front of him. There was something in her tone he couldn't ignore. It wasn't just desperation, it was determination. The fierce will to protect her children at all costs. Yet he maintained his rigid demeanor. "And what do you plan to do now?" "I don't know," she admitted, her eyes fixed on the floor. "But I'm not giving up." For a moment, silence stretched between them, broken only by Sophia's labored breathing. Lucas's gaze fell on the girl, whose fever seemed to worsen. Taking a step forward, he broke through his own emotional barrier. "She's not well," he said, nodding toward Sophia. "How long has she had a fever?" "Since this morning," Isabel replied, her voice trembling. "I tried to make her rest, but with the cold and the rain—" Lucas made a brisk gesture, motioning for her to follow him. "We can't wait. I'm taking her to a doctor now." "A doctor? But I can't afford that," Isabel said, alarmed. "Don't worry about it," he replied, grabbing his car keys and gesturing for Isabel to carry Sophia. The drive to the hospital was marked by tense silence, interrupted only by Sophia's faint whimpers. Isabel held her daughter close, casting worried glances at Lucas, who drove with focused determination. He seemed like someone accustomed to handling crises, yet there was a different glint in his eyes, a resolve that surprised even himself. When they arrived, Lucas handled everything efficiently at the reception. Isabel stayed by Sophia's side as she was treated, feeling a mix of gratitude and unease. Why was this man helping her so much? He was a reserved person, yet here he was, ensuring Sophia received the care she needed. Hours later, the diagnosis was confirmed. A respiratory infection worsened by the cold. Sophia would need medication and rest. On the drive back, Lucas broke the silence. "She'll be fine, but she needs care. You can't keep wandering around with the kids." "I know," Isabel murmured, holding Sophia tightly. Back at the mansion, Lucas prepared tea while Isabel put Sophia to bed. When she returned to the living room, she found Pedro on the floor, drawing with a pencil he'd found in a drawer. He looked up at Lucas and smiled. "Do you live here alone?" the boy asked bluntly. Lucas hesitated. "I do." That must be boring." Pedro laughed, his giggle innocent and free of malice. Lucas, about to reply, paused. Pedro's simplicity disarmed him in a way he didn't understand. Why did these children, whom he had just met, affect him so deeply? Later that night, Lucas found himself sitting in the armchair of his study, reflecting on the day's events. He was a man accustomed to control, to maintaining an emotional distance from everyone and everything. Yet, the arrival of this family had shattered something within him. Isabel's determination, Pedro's innocent laughter, Sophia's vulnerability, it all made him question the choices that had led him to such a solitary life. Upstairs, Isabel watched Sophia, now sleeping soundly, finally calmer after the medicine. Pedro was curled up in an armchair beside the bed, also fast asleep. Tears welled up in Isabel's eyes, but this time they weren't just from sadness. They were from relief, mixed with something new. Hope. Outside, the storm had passed, but inside the house, something far greater was just beginning. Time seemed to slow down inside the mansion. Days settled into a quiet routine, filled with small moments that gradually dissolved the invisible barriers between Isabel, Lucas, and the children. Sophia's fever had subsided, but the doctors had made it clear that her treatment needed to continue. She had been diagnosed with chronic asthma, worsened by the harsh conditions they had endured. Without hesitation, Lucas had taken on the responsibility of providing whatever was necessary, from medications to follow-up appointments. That morning, Pedro's laughter echoed through the house, a sound that hadn't graced Lucas's days in years. The boy explored the vast hallways as if he were in a magical castle. He stopped in the room where Lucas was sitting, reviewing some documents. "Lucas, were you ever a kid?" Pedro asked, with all the curiosity typical of his age. Lucas looked up from the papers, surprised by the question. "Yes, I was." "And what did you play?" Pedro pressed, stepping closer. Lucas hesitated, caught off guard. His childhood hadn't been filled with games. It had been marked by rigid discipline and loneliness, something he didn't want to share with such an energetic child. "I read a lot," he answered, skirting the subject. Pedro seemed satisfied with the answer and smiled before continuing his exploration. Lucas followed him with his eyes, noticing how at ease the boy seemed, as if the cold, impersonal house had temporarily transformed into a home for him. In the kitchen, Isabel was preparing lunch. Though Lucas had staff for that, she had insisted on cooking for the children, grateful for all he had done. He stepped into the room, drawn by the aroma of something simple but comforting. "You didn't have to," he said, crossing his arms as he watched her. "I like doing this," Isabel replied, without looking directly at him. "Besides, you've already done so much for us." The silence between them was laden with something undefined, a tension that wasn't uncomfortable, but made them cautious. Lucas finally broke the moment. "The doctor said Sophia will need consistent care. We can provide that here." "Here?" Isabel looked up, surprised. "For as long as you need," he said simply. She wanted to argue, perhaps refuse, but she knew he was right. Sophia's health came first. Even so, part of her felt uneasy. Lucas's generosity seemed genuine, but how much could she trust someone she barely knew? That afternoon, while the children slept, the doorbell rang. Lucas answered and found Raúl, a friend and business partner, standing there. Raúl didn't hide his surprise at the scene inside the house, toys scattered about, laughter echoing faintly in the distance. "What's going on here?" Raúl asked, stepping inside with the ease of familiarity. "Since when did your house turn into a daycare?" Lucas narrowed his eyes, clearly uncomfortable with the tone. "They needed help." Raúl looked at him incredulously. "This isn't like you, Lucas. Always so reserved, so distant. Why are you getting involved with this woman and her kids?" Because no one else would, Lucas replied firmly. Their exchange was interrupted by Isabel entering the room, carrying Sophia. She stopped upon seeing Raoul, sensing the tension even though she hadn't overheard the conversation. "Isabel, this is Raoul," Lucas introduced, his tone signaling that the previous discussion was over. Raoul greeted her politely, though curiosity was evident in his expression. Isabel withdrew quickly, uneasy with the stranger's presence. After Raoul left, Lucas remained in the living room, deep in thought. His friend's words made him reflect. He knew his decision to help Isabel and the children was impulsive, completely out of character, yet he couldn't ignore the impact their presence had on his life. For the first time in years, his house didn't feel like a mausoleum. Later, Isabel found Lucas in his study. She hesitated before speaking, but decided to voice her thoughts. "I know your life must have changed a lot because of us. I want you to know I'm grateful." Lucas looked at her, surprised by the vulnerability in her voice. "You don't need to thank me. It's what should be done." "Even so," she continued, "I don't want to take advantage of your generosity. As soon as Sophia is better, we'll find our way." Lucas felt a pang of discomfort at her words, but kept his expression neutral. "Don't worry about that right now." In that moment, Isabel noticed something in Lucas's gaze, a sincerity she hadn't expected. The barrier he maintained seemed to be cracking, though she didn't know what that meant, for him or for herself. As night fell, Lucas walked through the mansion's hallways, listening to Pedro's laughter echoing from upstairs. He paused at the door to the room where Sophia was sleeping, protected by Isabel. For a moment, something unnamed stirred in his heart. It wasn't just compassion or responsibility. It was a desire to protect this little family, not just for now, but for something greater. He didn't know how or why, but his life was changing, and he wasn't sure he wanted to go back to how it was before. The rising sun painted the sky in shades of orange and gold, but inside the mansion, the atmosphere was far from serene. Isabel paced back and forth in the room where Sophia slept. Her thoughts were tumultuous, filled with doubts and fears. She knew Lucas had been more generous than anyone ever had been to her, but the feeling of invading a stranger's life was suffocating. Trusting him, or anyone, seemed like too big a risk for someone with scars as deep as hers. Pedro, on the other hand, had completely adapted to the house. He ran through the hallways, explored the gardens, and above all, loved being around Lucas. The boy, who just months ago had lived in fear and tension, seemed to have blossomed amidst the safety the mansion provided. But for Isabel, the peace she had found here came with a cost. Every act of kindness from Lucas, every moment of connection with him, reminded her of how dangerous it was to rely on someone. That was why, on this morning, she decided to leave. "Mom, why are we packing?" Pedro asked, watching her carefully fold their few clothes. "It's time for us to go, sweetheart," Isabel replied without meeting his eyes. "But why? I like it here." "Lucas is nice," the boy said, his eyes filling with sadness. Isabel knelt in front of him, trying to stay calm. "I know you like him, but we can't stay. This isn't our home." Pedro crossed his arms, pouting. "But he said we could stay. He likes us, Mom." Those words hit Isabel like a blow. She knew Pedro was beginning to see Lucas as a father figure, something he had never truly had. But that only made her decision more urgent. She couldn't let herself put down roots here. She couldn't risk her heart or her children's. When Isabel came down with the bags, she found Lucas in the hall, seated on the sofa. He had a newspaper in his hands, but his eyes immediately rose to meet hers. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice calm but laced with intensity. I'm grateful for everything you've done for us, but we have to go," she said, trying to sound firm. Lucas stood, frowning. "Why? You're safe here." Sophia isn't fully recovered yet, and Pedro is clearly happy. Because this isn't fair to you, Isabel replied, her voice faltering. I can't take advantage of your generosity. Lucas hesitated, studying her closely. He knew there was more behind her decision. That's not it, Isabel. You're running. I'm protecting my children, she retorted, more forcefully than she intended. From what? He stepped closer, his voice lower, almost a whisper. From me? Isabel averted her gaze, unable to answer. But before she could leave, Sophia began coughing violently. Isabel rushed to her, finding her on the sofa nearby. The cough was dry and harsh, and Sophia was clearly struggling to breathe. Lucas acted quickly, grabbing the inhaler the doctor had prescribed. While he helped Sophia stabilize, Isabel felt a knot in her throat. She knew leaving now would be irresponsible. When Sophia finally drifted back to sleep, Isabel sat silently by her side. Lucas watched her, noticing the internal battle she was fighting. You don't have to do this alone, he said, his voice soft but full of meaning. Isabel looked at him, and in that moment, something shifted. She saw a sincerity in Lucas that she hadn't encountered in a long time. But accepting it meant confronting her own fears, and that terrified her. Later that night, Lucas found Isabel in the kitchen, distracted as she made tea. He sat at the table, deciding it was time to break some of the walls between them. When I was Pedro's age, my mother left me, he said suddenly. Isabel stopped, surprised by his revelation. What do you mean? Lucas continued, his eyes distant. My father died young, and she didn't know how to cope. One day she just left, leaving me with relatives who never really wanted me. I spent most of my life learning to rely only on myself. Isabel felt a pang in her chest at his words. I'm so sorry, she said sincerely. He shrugged, trying to appear indifferent, but the weight of his past was evident in his expression. For a long time, I thought it was better that way. Focus on work, avoid attachments, until you all showed up. Her heart raced at his words, but before she could respond, Lucas continued, And you, who's the man you're running from? Isabel took a deep breath, knowing she owed him an honest answer. His name is Marcelo. At first he was kind, but that changed after Pedro was born. He became violent. I endured it for years, but when he started taking it out on the children, I ran. The two sat in silence, united by their pain, but something else was growing between them. It wasn't just empathy, it was understanding. As the night deepened, Lucas realized something he hadn't felt in years, fear of losing Isabel and the children. For the first time in so long, he wasn't alone, and the bond he had formed with this small family was stronger than he had anticipated. For Isabel, the dilemma was clear. Leaving meant protecting her heart, but staying could mean a new beginning. And that terrified her more than any storm she had ever faced. The morning began with a strange unease. Sophia, usually calm, was unusually restless. Isabel noticed something was wrong when the little girl refused breakfast, uncommon for her, as she always smiled at the sight of fruit and toast on the table. Her face was pale, and her breathing had a wheezing sound that froze Isabel with worry. Lucas, something's wrong with Sophia, Isabel said as she hurried into the room where he was reviewing some documents. Lucas immediately looked up, noticing the anxiety on her face. What happened? She's not well. Her breathing, it sounds worse than ever, Isabel explained, trying to stay calm. Lucas stood without hesitation, following Isabel to the bedroom where Sophia was lying. The little girl looked frail, her breathing rapid and uneven. The wheezing was loud enough to be heard across the room. Lucas was already reaching for his phone. We're going to the hospital, he said decisively. We can't wait. Isabel nodded, picking Sophia up in her arms as Lucas called the hospital to inform them they were on their way. Pedro, watching from a distance, grabbed Lucas's hand as they walked to the car. Will Sophia be okay? the boy asked, his eyes brimming with tears. Lucas stopped and knelt to Pedro's level. "We'll do everything we can to help her. I promise." The drive to the hospital was tense. Sophia was visibly worsening, and every second felt like an eternity. Isabel held her close, whispering comforting words, while Lucas drove with a focus and intensity he had never shown before. The hospital loomed like a beacon of hope as they arrived, and the doctors immediately took Sophia to the emergency room. Hours passed as Lucas and Isabel waited for news. The silence between them was heavy with tension, but it also carried something deeper: solidarity. They were united by something greater, a shared responsibility that transcended their fears and insecurities. Finally, the doctor returned with a cautious expression. "Sophia's condition is critical, but we've stabilized her breathing for now. She'll need to stay hospitalized for monitoring." Isabel nearly collapsed with relief and exhaustion, but Lucas placed a firm hand on her shoulder, offering his support. "Do whatever's necessary," he told the doctor without hesitation. The doctor nodded before leaving, and Isabel let her tears fall freely. "I don't know what I would have done without you," she said, looking at Lucas. "You would have found a way. You always do," he replied, though his voice was laden with emotion. In the days that followed, Lucas stayed by Isabel's side through every step. He took care of Pedro, while she spent hours at the hospital with Sophia. When Sophia was awake, it was Lucas who showed up with small gifts, a stuffed animal, a picture book that made her smile even from her hospital bed. Pedro, meanwhile, began to see Lucas differently. He had always admired him, but something shifted profoundly as he watched Lucas care for his sister and support his mother. One night, as Lucas read a bedtime story to Pedro, the boy surprised him. "Lucas, can I call you Dad?" Lucas froze for a moment, caught off guard by the unexpected question. Then he smiled, a genuine warm smile that seemed to light up his face. "If you want to, of course you can." Pedro grinned and hugged him tightly, a gesture Lucas returned with emotion. For the first time, he felt his life had a real purpose. As Sophia's health improved, Isabel began to see something she had resisted for so long. Lucas was more than just a savior in a moment of crisis. He was dependable, steady, and most importantly, someone who loved her children as if they were his own. One evening, as Lucas and Isabel walked through the hospital corridors, she suddenly stopped and looked at him. "You didn't have to do any of this. I don't know why you did, but thank you." Lucas looked at her for a moment before answering. "I did it because you matter, all of you." The honesty in his voice broke through Isabel's last defenses. For the first time, she allowed her fear of trusting to be replaced by gratitude and something that felt like hope. When Sophia was finally discharged, something had shifted between them all. It was no longer a relationship of dependence or obligation. It was a real bond forged through adversity. Lucas, who had spent years surrounded by luxury and emptiness, felt for the first time that his house was a home. And Isabel, who had spent so long running, began to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could stop. As they walked out of the hospital together, Isabel held Sophia in her arms. Pedro held Lucas's hand, and something in their eyes said they were ready to face whatever came next, together. The days following Sophia's discharge passed in a calm that felt almost surreal. The little girl was recovering slowly, surrounded by the care of Isabel and Lucas. Pedro, more energetic than ever, had turned the mansion's hallways into his playground, now with Lucas's explicit permission. Lucas had even begun to enjoy the boy's antics, yet deep down, Isabel knew this newfound tranquility was only temporary. One afternoon, while Lucas was working in his office, Isabel approached with a decision finally formed in her mind. She found him engrossed in a report, but when he looked up and saw the expression on her face, he set the papers aside. I need to talk to you, Isabel began, her voice firm but heavy with emotion. Lucas nodded, gesturing for her to sit, but Isabel remained standing, nervously wringing her hands. I don't know how to thank you for everything you've done for me and the children. You've given us a home, care, and safety, but I think it's time for us to move on, she said, taking a deep breath to steady herself. Lucas was silent for a moment, absorbing her words. Finally, he stood, his eyes fixed on hers. Why do you think you need to leave? He asked, his voice calm but intense. Because this isn't fair to you. I've already taken up so much space in your life. You deserve to return to your routine, your freedom, Isabel replied, averting her gaze. Lucas stepped closer to her. Freedom? Isabel? Since you and the children arrived, this house has stopped being an empty place. For the first time in years, I feel like I belong to something. I don't want to go back to the way things were. I don't want you to leave. Isabel stood frozen, her heart racing. Lucas continued, his voice softer now. Do you think I'm helping out of pity or obligation? That's not it. I want to be here. I want to be part of your life, part of the children's lives. I want to build something with you. His words hung in the air, laden with meaning. Isabel felt tears well up in her eyes, but she remained hesitant. Lucas, you don't understand. I don't know how to trust. I don't know how to believe this is real. I've lost so much, she said, her voice almost a whisper. Lucas gently took her hands, forcing her to meet his gaze. I've lost a lot too. That's why I know the value of what we have here. I'm not asking you to trust me all at once. I'm asking you to stay, to give me a chance to show you that we can build something together. That night was marked by reflective silence. Isabel sat in the bedroom with Sophia sleeping beside her and Pedro playing on the floor with the toy cars Lucas had given him. She watched her children and thought about Lucas's words. Something inside her, a small flame of hope that had been extinguished for years, was beginning to reignite. The next morning, she found Lucas in the garden, a place he often went to think. He turned as he heard her approach, but before he could say anything, Isabel took a deep breath and spoke. I don't know where this will lead, but I'm willing to try. Lucas stared at her, surprised, and then a slow, sincere smile spread across his face. He stepped forward and took her hands again, as if afraid she might change her mind. That's all I needed to hear, he said, his voice soft and reassuring. The days that followed were marked by subtle but profound changes. Lucas began to incorporate Isabel and the children into his life definitively, not as guests, but as part of his routine. Pedro joined him on small projects in the garden, and Sophia, now fully recovered, filled the hallways with her laughter. One day, while they were all gathered in the living room, Pedro climbed onto Lucas's lap and hugged him. Dad, will you play with me later? He asked, with the natural ease of a child who had already accepted Lucas as part of the family. Lucas was momentarily speechless, but the smile he gave Pedro was answer enough. Isabel, watching the scene, felt a wave of emotion she couldn't hold back. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine the possibility of a truly happy future. Weeks later, as the sun set, Lucas gathered Isabel and the children in the garden. He seemed nervous, something rare for him. I wanted to say something to you all, he began, looking from Pedro to Sophia and finally to Isabel. You've changed my life. I didn't realize how much I needed you until you arrived. I want this to be permanent. I want you to stay here with me, as my family. Isabel's eyes filled with tears. She knew his proposal wasn't just about living together. It was about building a shared life. For the first time in years, she felt like she was exactly where she belonged. We want that too, she replied, smiling as she took his hands. In that moment, the mansion, which had once been a large and cold house, truly became a home. It was the beginning of something new, a family, unlikely yet bound by love, trust, and hope. Lucas, Isabel, Pedro, and Sofia had finally found what they had been searching for, a fresh start that would change their lives forever. I hope you enjoyed today's story. If you did, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Leave a like and comment below what you thought about the story. See you in the next video.